Johnny Depp. In A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, Freddy Krueger stalks a group of teenagers through their dreams. Among them is Glenn Lance, a young man played by someone who wasn't famous yet, Johnny Depp. Today, when people talk about Johnny Depp, many forget that his film debut actually happened in a horror movie. What's even funnier is that he wasn't seriously pursuing an acting career at the time. Depp had accompanied a friend to an audition and ended up catching the attention of the filmmakers. His character isn't the center of the story, but he appears throughout much of the film alongside the protagonist, Nancy Thompson, and he even becomes the victim of one of the franchise's most memorable deaths. Director Wes Craven initially wasn't sure about casting him. However, after the auditions, part of the crew believed he had enough screen presence to make it work, and they were right. Years later, Johnny Depp would become one of the most popular actors on the planet. Jack Black. In I Still Know What You Did Last Summer from 1998, we follow Julie James as she tries to move on from the events of the first film. Among the characters who cross Julie's path is a face that's impossible not to recognize today, Jack Black. Long before becoming one of Hollywood's most charismatic stars, he played Titus Telesco, an employee at the resort where much of the story takes place. And it's exactly the kind of role many people forget ever existed. Titus is laid back, eccentric, and already displays the over-the-top personality that would later become Jack Black's trademark. Despite his limited screen time, he stands out because his energy feels completely different from the tension dominating the rest of the movie. The Giant Spiders. In Eight-Legged Freaks, a small American town sees its peaceful routine turned upside down when hundreds of spiders begin growing abnormally and transforming into giant creatures. And right in the middle of this chaos is a young Scarlett Johansson. Long before becoming Marvel's Black Widow and one of Hollywood's biggest actresses, Johansson played Ashley Parker, the daughter of the town sheriff. She's part of the group trying to survive as the creatures spread throughout the area. What's most interesting is that this role came during a period when Scarlett was still building her career. She had already appeared in a few films, but she was still far from the global superstar she would later become. Watching it today, it's fascinating to see how much screen presence she already had, even while sharing the spotlight with a larger cast and visual effects that were the film's main attraction. The Crazy Man. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation, Matthew McConaughey delivers a performance that surprises a lot of people. Years before winning an Oscar and becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, he was part of one of the franchise's most controversial sequels. McConaughey plays Vilmer Slaughter, a member of the family terrorizing the film's protagonists. And if you're imagining a quiet, calculating villain, think again. Vilmer is the exact opposite. He spends most of the movie acting unpredictably, talking non-stop, exploding with rage, and making everyone around him uncomfortable. He's the type of character who feels capable of doing absolutely anything at any moment. Although Leatherface is the franchise's most famous face, many scenes end up being completely dominated by Vilmer's chaotic energy. McConaughey delivers an exaggerated performance, but one that perfectly fits the strange and almost surreal tone the film adopts throughout. In practice, he ends up becoming one of its most memorable characters. The cast also included Renee Zellweger, who was still far from fame, so the movie managed to bring together two future Oscar winners in a horror sequel that few would ever expect to contain that kind of hidden talent. Watching it today, it's almost impossible not to be impressed by the contrast. We're talking about the same actor who would later star in Interstellar, Dallas Buyers Club, and True Detective. The Survivor. In Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers, Paul Rudd played a role that many people simply forget existed. He portrayed Tommy Doyle, a character fans had known since the very first Halloween. As a child, Tommy was the boy Laurie Strode was babysitting on the night Michael Myers terrorized the town. Years later, in The Curse of Michael Myers, he returns as an adult, completely obsessed with the events of that night. Unlike many victims in the franchise, Tommy spends years trying to understand who Michael Myers really is. He studies the murders, follows the killer's patterns, and believes there's something much bigger behind all the violence. This was Paul Rudd's first major film role, and looking back today, it's funny to realize he hadn't yet developed the easygoing image that would later make him famous. Here, he plays a serious, introspective character who is constantly worried about the threat haunting the town. Jennifer Aniston. Before the romantic comedies, the awards, and the phenomenon that was Friends, Jennifer Aniston was facing one of the most unlikely monsters in horror history. In 1993's Leprechaun, she played Tori Redding, a teenager who returns to her father's farm after spending most of her life living in the city. At first, Tori is far from happy about leaving her comfortable life behind. The problem is that this adjustment quickly becomes secondary when an old secret involving a murderous leprechaun resurfaces and puts everyone around her in danger. What's most interesting is that Jennifer plays the role completely straight, even though the movie contains plenty of moments that seem wildly over the top today. While the tiny villain spreads chaos in search of his stolen gold coins, Tori becomes one of the few people willing to confront the situation and protect those around her. For years, Aniston rarely talked about Leprechaun in interviews. As her career grew, the film became more of a curious footnote from the beginning of her journey. Even so, many fans still enjoy revisiting it precisely because it offers a chance to see a future Hollywood superstar in a role completely different from anything she would later become known for. Leonardo DiCaprio. In Critters 3, Leonardo DiCaprio made his film debut in a role that many people don't even know exists. Long before the worldwide success, he appeared in a low-budget horror sequel surrounded by extremely dangerous alien creatures. In the film, DiCaprio plays Josh, a boy who lives in an apartment building in Los Angeles with his family. The building's routine is completely turned upside down when the critters, furry creatures from outer space, known for attacking anything they come across, invade the complex. From that moment on, the residents realize they're trapped in a place where danger can be lurking behind any door. Although Josh isn't exactly the story's main protagonist, Leonardo receives a significant amount of screen time throughout the movie. Even in his first feature film, you can already see a confidence that stands out. While many young actors seem uncomfortable in front of the camera, DiCaprio appears natural in virtually every scene. Critters 3 was released only a few years before DiCaprio caught Hollywood's attention in films like What's Eating Gilbert Grape. In other words, his rise happened very quickly. Even so, it's still fun for movie fans to go back and see a young Leonardo DiCaprio surrounded by alien monsters. Brad Pitt. In the 1989 film Cutting Class, Brad Pitt appeared in one of the most unusual roles of his entire career. In the film, he plays Dwight Ingalls, a popular student who attracts attention wherever he goes. The story follows a series of strange events at a high school, especially after Brian Woods, a young man recently released from a psychiatric institution, returns to town. As people connected to the school start turning up dead, suspicion spreads among several characters, creating a constant atmosphere of paranoia. What's most interesting is that Brad Pitt was still at the beginning of his career, and clearly wasn't treated as the production's big star. Watching it today creates a rather amusing feeling because it's impossible not to immediately recognize someone who would later become one of the most famous faces in cinema. Even so, he already displays the charisma that would eventually help turn him into the lead of major blockbusters. George Clooney. In 1987's Return to Horror High, George Clooney made one of his earliest appearances on the big screen. The story revolves around a film crew that returns to a school where murders once took place in order to produce a movie based on the real events. As you'd expect from an 80s horror film, things quickly spiral out of control. Amid all the chaos appears Oliver, a character played by Clooney. Oliver isn't one of the central characters, and in fact, his role is relatively small compared to the career he would later build. Still, it's impossible not to notice that Clooney already had strong screen presence. Even in brief scenes, he stands out thanks to the confidence and charisma that would later become his trademarks. Many people consider Return to Horror High to be his theatrical debut, but there's actually some debate among fans. That's because George Clooney also appeared in Grizzly 2: Revenge, a movie that was filmed years earlier. The problem is that the production remained shelved for decades and wasn't released until much later. Because of that, for most audiences, Return to Horror High remains their first glimpse of Clooney on the big screen. Sandra Bullock. In the 1993 film The Vanishing, Sandra Bullock played Diane Shaver, the girlfriend of Jeff Harriman. At the beginning of the story, the couple is traveling together when something strange happens during a stop at a gas station. Diane disappears without a trace, turning her disappearance into the central mystery that drives the entire plot. From that moment on, Jeff spends years trying to uncover what really happened. Sandra doesn't have a huge amount of screen time in the film. Even so, her character is absolutely essential to the story. After all, everything revolves around her disappearance and the consequences it creates. What's most interesting about revisiting The Vanishing today is realizing that Sandra Bullock was still building her career. The film arrived just 1 year before Speed turned her into a worldwide phenomenon alongside Keanu Reeves. In other words, she was only one step away from completely changing her status in Hollywood. Ryan Gosling. In Frankenstein and Me, Ryan Gosling was part of a small production that blended youthful adventure, comedy, and classic horror elements. Gosling's character, Kenny, lives next door to Earl Williams, a teenager obsessed with old monster movies. When Earl discovers a body hidden under mysterious circumstances, he becomes convinced that he can recreate Dr. Frankenstein's experiments and bring the dead back to life. As you'd expect, things quickly begin to spiral out of control. Although Kenny isn't the story's main protagonist, he's present throughout much of the adventure and serves as one of Earl's closest companions. He's the kind of character who helps move the plot forward while reacting to his friends' increasingly ridiculous ideas. The film arrived during a period when Gosling was still known primarily for television appearances. His image as a Hollywood star was still very far away. In fact, Frankenstein and Me was released years before he gained recognition in larger productions and long before he became one of the most respected actors of his generation. Tom Hanks. He Knows You're Alone is one of those slashers that emerged during the wave of success created by films like Halloween. The story follows Amy Jensen, a young woman about to get married who finds herself stalked by a killer with a disturbing obsession with brides. In the middle of the story, we meet Elliot, played by Tom Hanks in his film debut. And the funniest part is that he appears in a relatively simple scene. No chases, no jump scares, and no direct involvement with the main threat. Elliot is a psychology student who talks with Amy and offers an interesting reflection about why so many people enjoy horror movies. The scene only lasts a few minutes, but it has become a fascinating time capsule for movie fans. After all, we're talking about an actor who would later become one of the most respected names in Hollywood. Watching the film today is almost like discovering a completely different version of Tom Hanks. The Cultist. The Devil's Reign is one of those horror films that feels like a complete 1970s fever dream. The story follows a war between a family and a powerful satanic cult led by Jonathan Corbis, a man seeking to recover a book capable of giving him control over the souls of his followers. The result is a bizarre mix of occultism, curses, and strange imagery. In the middle of all this appears a young John Travolta in his first film role. And when I say role, I really mean role. He plays one of Corbis's cult members and can be seen wearing a black robe during several scenes. The character doesn't even have any lines, which means many people watch the entire movie without realizing he's there. Travolta was still far from becoming a celebrity. At the time, he was simply a young actor trying to find his place in Hollywood. Not long afterward, his career would explode in spectacular fashion, turning him into one of the biggest movie stars of the following decades. The Basketball Player. Buffy the Vampire Slayer introduced audiences to a very different version of the franchise that would later become famous on television. The story follows Buffy Summers, an apparently ordinary student who discovers she has been chosen to hunt vampires. Amid all the chaos comes an appearance so brief that many people don't even notice it. Before becoming a Hollywood star, Ben Affleck shows up in a small scene as a basketball player during a school game. The moment occurs when vampires invade the gymnasium and turn a normal sporting event into something completely unexpected. What's interesting is that Affleck actually had a line in the scene, but there's a funny story behind it. Years later, the actor revealed that his voice was replaced in the final version of the film. According to stories from the production, the director wasn't satisfied with his delivery and decided to dub the line with another voice. In other words, Ben Affleck appears on screen, but the voice the audience hears isn't his.
Thank you, man.
Sounds like Chris Tucker.
That helps explain why so many people forget about his appearance. Not only is it extremely brief, but the character also has no real importance to the main story. He's simply there to react to the chaos unfolding around him. Just a few years later, Affleck would become one of Hollywood's most talked about young actors, win an Oscar for Good Will Hunting, and build a career that would include everything from major dramas to playing Batman himself.
Dear Blade.
On Screen is a video where we show horror movies where evil wins in the end. Click and watch. See you there.